I was there when Captain Jack pulled the pistol from beneath his coat and shot General Edward Canby in the face, was standing 3 feet away when the only United States Army general ever killed in the Indian Wars fell backward into the lava rocks with blood pouring from his shattered skull, was one of the warriors who had agreed that this act of violence was necessary, that the whites had betrayed us one too many times, that the sanctity of peace negotiations meant nothing to them, that they had come to this meeting armed and prepared to arrest us despite their promises of safe conduct, that if we did not strike first, we would be taken prisoner and hanged, that our only choice was to kill the peace commissioners and to continue our desperate fight for survival in the lava beds that had become our fortress and our prison, and the place where we would make our final stand against an enemy that outnumbered us 10-1. But that could not defeat us because we knew every cave and every crevice and every hidden passage in this landscape of frozen stone that had been created by ancient volcanic eruptions and that now served as the perfect natural fortress for a small band of desperate warriors fighting for their very existence. My name is Scarface Charlie, and I am Modoc, one of the Maclacs, the people of the lake, who have lived along the shores of Tule Lake and the Lost River in the land where California meets Oregon since the beginning of time, since the days when the world was young and the spirits walked among men and gave us this land as our home and our birthright. We are a small people, have never been numerous, never numbered more than a few hundred individuals in total, living in small bands scattered along the lakeshore and the river valleys, surviving through our knowledge of the land and the water, through our skill at fishing and hunting waterfowl, through our cunning and our adaptability, and our willingness to fight when necessary and to make peace when possible. I was 24 winters old in the spring of 1873, a young warrior who had proven himself in several skirmishes with the whites and with our traditional enemies, the Klamath, who had earned a reputation for courage and skill in battle, who bore the scars of combat on my face and my body, who was loyal to our leader Kintpuash, the man the whites called Captain Jack, who was the chief of our band, who was trying desperately to find a way to keep our people alive and free, in a world that was becoming increasingly hostile to our very existence, that was closing in on us from all sides, that was determined to force us onto reservations where we would lose our identity and our culture and our connection to the land that had sustained us for countless generations. I was born in 1849, in a lodge along the shores of Tule Lake, in a world that was still relatively peaceful, still relatively free from white interference, still a place where the Modoc could live according to our own customs and our own values. My father was a warrior named Grey Wolf, a man who had fought against the Klamath and the Shasta and other neighboring tribes, who had earned respect through his courage and his skill, who had taught me the ways of a warrior from the time I was old enough to hold a bow. My mother was a woman named Waterbird, a skilled basket maker and gatherer, a woman who knew every plant that grew along the lakeshore, who could identify hundreds of different species and knew which ones could be eaten and which ones could be used for medicine and which ones were poisonous. I had 2 brothers and 1 sister. My older brother, Stonehand, was killed in a skirmish with white settlers in 1867, was shot while trying to defend our fishing grounds from whites who were claiming ownership of lands that had always belonged to the Modoc. My younger brother, Running Fox, died of disease on the Klamath Reservation in 1869, was one of many Modoc who succumbed to the illnesses that swept through the reservation, that killed our people by the dozens, that were as deadly as any weapon the whites used against us. My sister, Morning Light, survived, and was with us in the stronghold, was one of the women who kept us alive during the siege, who gathered water and prepared food and cared for the wounded, and provided the emotional support that allowed us to continue fighting even when the situation seemed hopeless. Captain Jack, whose Modoc name was Kintpuash, was perhaps 40 winters old in 1873, was a man of medium height and strong build, with intelligent eyes and a face that showed both determination and weariness, a face that reflected the burden of leadership in impossible circumstances. He had become chief of our band in the 1860s, had inherited the position from his father, had taken on the responsibility of leading our people through the most difficult period in our history, through the time when the whites were flooding into our territory, when our traditional way of life was being destroyed, when we were being forced to make impossible choices between resistance and accommodation, between fighting for our freedom and accepting the reservations and the loss of everything that made us Modoc. Captain Jack was not a war chief by nature or by preference. He was a diplomat, a negotiator, a man who understood that the Modoc were too few and too weak to defeat the whites in a prolonged war, who believed that our only hope for survival was to find some kind of accommodation with the Americans, to negotiate treaties that would allow us to maintain some degree of autonomy and some connection to our traditional lands, to preserve something of our culture and our identity, even if we had to give up much of our territory and much of our freedom. He had spent years trying to work with the whites, trying to find peaceful solutions to the conflicts that arose, trying to be reasonable and diplomatic and patient, even in the face of broken promises and betrayals and injustices. But by 1873, his patience had been exhausted, his faith in negotiation had been shattered, and he had been forced into a position where violence seemed to be the only option left, where resistance seemed to be the only way to maintain any shred of dignity and self-respect, where dying as a free Modoc seemed preferable to living as a prisoner on a reservation that was slowly killing us through starvation and disease and despair. The Modoc had never been a large or a powerful people. Our entire nation numbered perhaps 500 people at most, living in small bands along the shores of Tule Lake and the Lost River, in a region of extraordinary beauty and harshness, a land of vast marshes and open water, of sagebrush plains and pine forests, of volcanic formations and lava beds that created a landscape unlike any other on Earth. The region was rich in resources, particularly in waterfowl and fish, with millions of ducks and geese migrating through the area each year, with the lake and the rivers teeming with salmon and trout and suckerfish, with abundant game in the surrounding hills and forests. We lived in semi-permanent villages during the winter, in structures made of tule reeds and wooden frames, structures that were well insulated and comfortable even in the coldest weather. In the summer, we moved to temporary camps, following the seasonal patterns of fish and game, harvesting the plants and roots that ripened at different times of the year, living a life that was closely attuned to the rhythms of nature, that required deep knowledge of the land and the water and the cycles of life that governed everything. Our society was organized into extended family groups, with leadership based on a combination of heredity and demonstrated ability. Chiefs were expected to be wise and generous and brave, to put the welfare of the people above their own interests, to lead by example rather than by command. We had a rich spiritual life, believed in a creator and in numerous spirits that inhabited the natural world, performed ceremonies to ensure good hunting and fishing, to heal the sick, to mark important transitions in life such as birth and puberty and marriage and death. We were not an aggressive people, did not seek war with our neighbors, but we were also not passive, were willing to fight when necessary to defend our territory and our rights. We had traditional enemies, particularly the Klamath to the north, with whom we had fought intermittently for generations over access to fishing grounds and hunting territories. But these conflicts were limited in scope and in violence, were more about demonstrating courage and gaining status than about conquest or extermination, were governed by customs and rules that both sides understood and generally respected. The whites began coming to our territory in significant numbers in the 1840s and 1850s, drawn by the discovery of gold in California and by the opening of wagon roads that passed through our lands on the way to the gold fields and to the settlements in Oregon and California. At first, the contact was relatively peaceful. We traded with the whites, provided them with food and guidance, helped them cross our territory, were curious about these strange people with their wagons and their animals and their different ways of doing things. But as more and more whites came, as they began to settle permanently in our lands, as they began to claim ownership of the places where we had always lived and hunted and fished, the conflicts began. The whites did not understand or respect our concepts of land use and ownership, did not recognize that we had rights to the territory we had occupied for countless generations, saw the land as empty and available for the taking, saw us as obstacles to be removed rather than as people with legitimate claims and rights. The whites brought diseases that devastated our population, diseases like smallpox and measles and influenza that we had no immunity to, that killed our people by the dozens and the hundreds, that reduced our population dramatically in just a few years. They brought alcohol, which had a destructive effect on our society, which led to violence and social breakdown, which was used by unscrupulous traders to cheat us out of our possessions and our dignity. They brought a different economic system, one based on individual ownership and accumulation of wealth, one that was incompatible with our traditional ways of sharing and reciprocity, one that created new forms of inequality and conflict within our communities. And most significantly, they brought the conviction that they had the right to take our land, that their claims were superior to ours, that their way of life was more advanced and more legitimate than ours, that we should either assimilate into their society or be removed to reservations where we would be out of the way of white settlement and development. The conflicts escalated through the 1850s and 1860s, with increasing violence on both sides, with Modoc warriors attacking white settlers who were encroaching on our lands, with white vigilantes and militia groups attacking Modoc camps and killing our people in retaliation. The violence was brutal and indiscriminate, with women and children often being the victims, with atrocities committed by both sides, with a cycle of revenge and counter-revenge that seemed to have no end. In 1864, the United States government, seeking to end the violence and to open up the region for white settlement, negotiated a treaty with the Modoc and with our neighbors the Klamath. The treaty, which was signed by Captain Jack and other Modoc leaders, required us to give up our lands along Tule Lake and the Lost River, virtually our entire traditional territory, and to move to a reservation on the Klamath River, to share that reservation with the Klamath people, who were our traditional enemies, who outnumbered us significantly, who had their own leaders and their own interests that often conflicted with ours. In exchange for giving up our lands, the treaty promised that we would be provided with food and supplies, that we would be protected from white encroachment, that we would be allowed to maintain our culture and our way of life on the reservation, that we would be treated fairly and with respect by the Indian agents who would be responsible for administering the reservation. These promises, like so many promises made to Indian peoples by the United States government, would prove to be worthless, would be broken almost as soon as they were made, would turn out to be lies designed to get us to sign away our lands without resistance. Captain Jack and many of our people moved to the Klamath Reservation in 1864, as the treaty required, tried to make the best of a bad situation, tried to adapt to reservation life, tried to live peacefully with the Klamath despite the tensions and the conflicts that arose almost immediately. But life on the reservation was intolerable from the beginning, was a nightmare of poverty and hunger and disease and humiliation that made it clear that the government had no intention of honoring its promises, that the reservation was not a place where we could maintain our culture and our dignity, but was rather a place where we were expected to die quietly and conveniently, out of the way of white settlement. The land that had been allocated to the Modoc on the reservation was poor, was the worst land on the reservation, was land that the Klamath did not want, was land that was difficult to farm, and that had limited access to water and to fishing grounds. The Klamath, who outnumbered us and who had more influence with the Indian agents, took the best lands and the best resources for themselves, left us with the scraps, treated us as inferiors and as intruders, made it clear that they resented our presence on what they considered to be their reservation. The Indian agents, who were supposed to protect us and to ensure that the treaty promises were kept, were corrupt and incompetent, were more interested in enriching themselves than in helping the Indians under their care, sold the supplies that were supposed to be distributed to us, pocketed the money that was supposed to be used for our benefit, ignored our complaints and our requests for help, treated us with contempt and indifference. The food that was provided was inadequate in quantity and poor in quality, was often spoiled or inedible, was not enough to sustain us through the winter, left us constantly hungry and malnourished and vulnerable to disease. The diseases that had already reduced our population continued to ravage us on the reservation, with epidemics of measles and influenza and other illnesses sweeping through our camps, killing our children and our elders, leaving the survivors weakened and demoralized. The medical care that had been promised in the treaty was virtually non-existent, with no doctors or medicines available, with the sick left to die or to recover on their own, with no help from the government that had promised to take care of us. The Klamath harassment was constant and demoralizing, with Klamath men stealing from us, assaulting our women, mocking us and insulting us, making it clear that we were not welcome on the reservation, that they wanted us gone. The Indian agents did nothing to stop this harassment, either because they did not care or because they sympathized with the Klamath, who were more numerous and more influential, who had better relationships with the agents, who were seen as more cooperative and more civilized than the Modoc. After several years of trying to make the reservation work, after countless complaints to the Indian agents that were ignored, after repeated requests to be allowed to return to our traditional lands that were denied, after watching our people die of starvation and disease and despair, Captain Jack made the decision that would set in motion the chain of events that would lead to the Modoc War and to the death of General Canby and to the execution of Captain Jack and the scattering of the Modoc people. In 1870, Captain Jack led approximately 150 Modoc, about one-third of the total Modoc population, off the Klamath Reservation back to the Lost River, back to our traditional lands, back to the place where we had always lived, where our ancestors were buried, where we felt we belonged, where we could live as Modoc, rather than as prisoners on a reservation that was killing us. It was an act of defiance, an act of desperation, an act that Captain Jack knew might lead to conflict with the whites, but that he felt was necessary if the Modoc were to survive as a people, if we were to maintain any connection to our culture and our identity, if we were to have any hope of living with dignity and self-respect. We returned to the Lost River and set up our camps along the river, resumed our traditional way of life, fished and hunted and gathered as we had always done, tried to live peacefully and to avoid conflict with the white settlers who were now living in the area. For a while, we were left alone. The white settlers in the area were not happy about our return, complained to the authorities, demanded that we be forced back to the reservation, but for a time nothing happened. And we were able to live in relative peace, to enjoy the freedom and the connection to our land that we had lost on the reservation, to be Modoc in the land of the Modoc. But the peace could not last, was always fragile, was always dependent on the tolerance of the whites and the priorities of the government. The white settlers continued to complain, continued to demand that we be removed, continued to pressure the government to take action, to enforce the treaty, to force us back to the reservation where we belonged. And finally, in November of 1872, after 2 years of our unauthorized presence on the Lost River, after 2 years of complaints from white settlers, after 2 years of the government trying to decide what to do about the Modoc problem, the United States Army was ordered to force us back to the Klamath Reservation, to use whatever force was necessary to compel our compliance, to demonstrate that the government's authority could not be defied, that Indians who left their assigned reservations would be punished, that resistance would not be tolerated. The order was given to Captain James Jackson, commander of a cavalry detachment stationed at Fort Klamath, to proceed to the Lost River, to arrest Captain Jack and the other Modoc leaders, to disarm the Modoc warriors, and to escort the entire band back to the Klamath Reservation. Captain Jackson was a career soldier, a man who had fought in the Civil War, who was experienced in combat, who was confident in his ability to handle what he expected would be a simple police action against a small band of Indians who would surely surrender when faced with the authority and the firepower of the United States Army. On the morning of November 29, 1872, Captain Jackson led his cavalry detachment, approximately 40 soldiers, into our camp on the Lost River, rode in with weapons drawn, demanded that we surrender our weapons immediately and prepare to return to the reservation, threatened to use force if we did not comply without delay. The soldiers were tense and aggressive, were treating us not as human beings with rights and concerns, but as criminals who had violated the law and who needed to be punished, were not interested in hearing our complaints about the reservation or our reasons for leaving, were simply there to enforce the government's orders and to take us back by force if necessary. Captain Jack tried to negotiate, tried to explain that we could not live on the Klamath Reservation, that we were being mistreated there, that we were starving and dying there, that we had a right to live in our own land, that we were not causing any trouble for the white settlers, that we just wanted to be left alone to live as Modoc. But Captain Jackson would not listen, would not negotiate, would not consider any option except our immediate surrender and our return to the reservation. He gave us an ultimatum: surrender your weapons now and prepare to leave, or we will take them by force and you will be arrested and punished. The situation escalated quickly, became tense and dangerous, became a confrontation that neither side wanted, but that both sides seemed unable to avoid. The Modoc warriors were armed, were not willing to surrender their weapons, were not willing to return to the reservation, were prepared to fight if necessary to defend their right to stay in their own land. The soldiers were under orders to disarm us and to take us back to the reservation, were prepared to use force if we resisted, were confident that their superior numbers and firepower would allow them to quickly overcome any resistance. Someone fired a shot. To this day, no one knows for certain who fired first. Whether it was a soldier or a Modoc warrior, whether it was intentional or accidental, whether it was a deliberate attempt to start a fight or a nervous reaction to the tension, and suddenly the camp erupted in violence. Soldiers shooting at Modoc, Modoc shooting back, people running and screaming and dying, chaos and terror, and the beginning of a war that would last for months, and that would end with the death of a general, and the hanging of our leaders, and the scattering of our people. In that first battle at the Lost River, we lost several people, including women and children who were caught in the crossfire, who were shot as they tried to flee, who died in the chaos and the confusion of the attack. But we also killed several soldiers, wounded many more, and we fought with a ferocity and a determination that surprised the soldiers, that made them realize that this was not going to be the simple police action they had expected, that the Modoc were willing to fight and die rather than return to the reservation. As the battle raged, as it became clear that we couldn't hold our position against the soldiers, Captain Jack made the decision to retreat, to abandon the camp, to scatter into the countryside, to regroup in the one place where we knew we could defend ourselves, where we knew the soldiers could not easily follow, where we knew we could make a stand, the lava beds south of Tule Lake, a vast expanse of volcanic rock formations and caves and crevices and natural fortifications that we called the Stronghold. That was the most defensible position imaginable. That was a fortress created by nature specifically for a small group of defenders fighting against a much larger force. We fled from the Lost River camp, scattered in different directions to confuse the soldiers, regrouped over the next few days in the lava beds, gathered our people, approximately 150 individuals including 53 warriors, and prepared to defend ourselves in the stronghold, prepared to demonstrate that we would not surrender, that we would not return to the reservation, that we would fight to the death if necessary to preserve our freedom and our dignity as Modoc. The stronghold was an extraordinary place, a landscape unlike any other, a testament to the violent geological forces that had shaped this region thousands of years ago. The lava beds covered an area of approximately 50 square miles, were the result of volcanic eruptions from nearby volcanic vents, were flows of molten rock that had cooled and hardened into a maze of ridges and trenches and caves and tunnels that created a landscape that was almost impossible to traverse if you did not know the paths, that was filled with natural defensive positions, that was perfect for a small group of defenders fighting against a much larger attacking force. The lava had cooled in strange and fantastic formations, creating walls and towers and caves, creating trenches that were deep enough to provide cover from rifle fire, creating passages and tunnels that connected different parts of the stronghold, creating a three-dimensional maze that only those who knew it intimately could navigate. The surface of the lava was rough and sharp, was covered with jagged edges and points that could cut through boots and clothing, that made movement difficult and painful, that slowed down any attacking force and made them vulnerable to defenders firing from concealed positions. Within the stronghold were hidden springs and pools of water, sources that were known only to the Modoc, that were concealed in caves and crevices, that would allow us to survive a siege, that would give us a critical advantage over any attacking force that would have to bring their water with them or go without. There were also caves that were large enough to shelter our entire band, that provided protection from the weather and from artillery fire, that had multiple entrances and exits, that could be defended easily against attackers. We reached the stronghold in early December of 1872, set up our camp in the caves and the protected areas, organized our defenses, prepared for the attack that we knew would come. Captain Jack divided the warriors into groups, assigned each group to defend specific areas of the stronghold, made sure that every approach was covered, that every path was watched, that we would have advance warning of any attack, that we would be able to concentrate our forces at any point where the soldiers tried to break through. We had 53 warriors, men who were experienced fighters, who knew the terrain intimately, who were armed with rifles and ammunition that we had acquired through trade and through previous conflicts, who were determined to defend our families and our right to exist as Modoc. We also had approximately 100 women and children, and old people, people who needed to be protected, who needed to be fed and cared for, who were the reason we were fighting, who represented the future of the Modoc people, if we could somehow survive this conflict. The soldiers did not attack immediately, were cautious after their experience at the Lost River, were waiting for reinforcements, were trying to understand the terrain and the defensive positions we had established, were planning their attack carefully to minimize their casualties and to maximize their chances of success. But they also established a perimeter around the stronghold, set up camps at various points, began to patrol the area, began to cut off our access to the outside world, began to lay siege to us in the hope that they could starve us out or force us to surrender without having to assault our positions. The first major attack came on January 17, 1873, when more than 300 soldiers and volunteers, including regular Army troops, Oregon and California militia, and civilian volunteers who hated Indians and who were eager to kill Modoc, attacked the stronghold in a coordinated assault from multiple directions, confident that their superior numbers and their superior firepower would allow them to quickly overwhelm us, to force us to surrender, to end this embarrassing resistance by a handful of Indians who had dared to defy the authority of the United States government. The attack began in the early morning, in thick fog that reduced visibility to just a few yards, that made it difficult for the soldiers to see where they were going or to maintain their formations. That gave us a significant advantage because we knew the terrain and could move through it even in the fog, while the soldiers were stumbling and getting lost and separating into smaller groups that lost contact with each other. The soldiers advanced through the lava beds in columns, trying to surround the stronghold, trying to cut off our escape routes, trying to force us into a position where we would have to fight or surrender. But we were ready for them, had been watching their approach, had positioned ourselves in the rocks above the paths they were using, had prepared ambushes at every turn, had coordinated our defenses so that we could concentrate our fire on any group of soldiers that entered the killing zones we had identified. We let them come deep into the lava beds, let them get confused and disoriented in the maze of rocks and trenches, let them separate into smaller groups that lost contact with each other, let them get into positions where they were vulnerable and where we had every advantage. And then we attacked, firing from concealed positions, shooting down at them from the rocks above, using our knowledge of the terrain to move quickly from one position to another, to appear and disappear like ghosts, to strike and then vanish before they could respond, to inflict casualties without exposing ourselves to their fire. The battle lasted all day, was a series of small engagements and ambushes rather than a single large battle, was a demonstration of the advantage that knowledge of terrain gives to defenders, was a humiliation for the United States Army that would be reported in newspapers across the country, that would become a source of embarrassment for the military and for the government. That would demonstrate that a small group of determined fighters could defeat a much larger and better equipped force if they had the terrain and the will and the courage. By the end of the day, the soldiers had suffered heavy casualties, more than 30 killed and wounded, with some estimates putting the number even higher, while we had suffered none, had not lost a single warrior, had successfully defended the stronghold against an enemy that outnumbered us 6-1. The soldiers retreated, withdrew from the lava beds, regrouped and waited for reinforcements, tried to understand how they had been defeated so completely by such a small force, tried to figure out how to attack a position that seemed to be impregnable, that seemed to be designed by nature specifically to be defended by a small group against a large army. The victory gave us confidence, gave us hope that we might be able to hold out indefinitely, that we might be able to force the government to negotiate terms that we could accept, that we might be able to achieve some kind of settlement that would allow us to stay in our land, or at least to have a reservation of our own separate from the Klamath. But it also made the government more determined to defeat us, more committed to crushing our resistance, more willing to commit whatever resources were necessary to force us to surrender. Over the next few months, the army brought in more troops, more supplies, more equipment, eventually concentrating more than 500 soldiers around the stronghold, along with artillery and mortars and all the weapons of modern warfare. They built fortifications around the perimeter, established supply lines settled in for a long siege, determined to starve us out or to wear us down, or to eventually assault the stronghold with overwhelming force that would crush our resistance regardless of the cost in casualties. The siege was difficult for us, was a test of our endurance and our determination, was a daily struggle to survive on limited supplies, to care for our wounded, to maintain our morale in the face of constant pressure and constant danger. We survived on the supplies we had stored in the caves, on the water from hidden springs, on the occasional successful raid to capture supplies from the army camps, on our determination and our courage and our knowledge that we were fighting for our very existence. That surrender would mean death or exile, or life on a reservation that was worse than death. But we also continued to inflict casualties on the soldiers, continued to ambush their patrols, continued to demonstrate that we could not be defeated easily, that every attempt to assault the stronghold would result in heavy losses, that the army was paying a high price for its determination to force us to surrender. The siege attracted national attention, became a source of embarrassment for the United States government, became a symbol of Indian resistance, became a story that was told in newspapers across the country, became something that the government desperately wanted to end, but did not know how to end, without either suffering massive casualties or appearing weak and ineffective. And so, in the spring of 1873, the government decided to try a different approach, decided to attempt to negotiate a peaceful settlement, to offer Captain Jack and the Modoc terms that might be acceptable, to find a way to end the conflict without more bloodshed, to resolve the situation through diplomacy rather than through continued military action. A peace commission was established, led by General Edward Canby, the commander of the Department of the Columbia, a man who was known for his fairness and his willingness to negotiate with Indians, a man who had a reputation for honoring his commitments, a man who the government believed might be able to find a peaceful solution to the Modoc War. General Canby was 55 years old, was a career soldier who had graduated from West Point, who had fought in the Mexican War and the Civil War, who had served in various frontier posts, who had extensive experience dealing with Indians, who was known as a fair and honorable man, who genuinely seemed to want to find peaceful solutions to conflicts rather than to simply use military force to crush resistance. He was tall and dignified, with a grey beard and a calm demeanor, a man who inspired confidence and respect, a man who seemed to be the perfect choice to negotiate with Captain Jack and to find a way to end the Modoc War without more bloodshed. The Peace Commission also included Alfred Meacham, a former superintendent of Indian Affairs in Oregon, a man who had worked with the Modoc before, who knew Captain Jack personally, who had some understanding of Modoc culture and concerns, who was sympathetic to Indian rights, and who believed that the government had not treated the Modoc fairly. Also on the commission was Eleazar Thomas, a Methodist minister who had volunteered to serve as a peace commissioner, who believed that Christian principles of forgiveness and reconciliation could help resolve the conflict, who was naive and idealistic, and who would pay with his life for his faith in the goodness of human nature. The peace negotiations began in March of 1873, with meetings held in neutral ground between the stronghold and the army positions, with both sides agreeing to a temporary ceasefire, with both sides expressing a willingness to find a peaceful solution, to end the bloodshed, to find terms that would be acceptable to both the Modoc and the government. The meetings were held in the open, on the lava rocks, with small groups from each side meeting to discuss proposals and counter-proposals to try to find common ground, to bridge the gap between the government's demands and the Modoc's needs. The government's position was clear and non-negotiable. The Modoc must return to the Klamath Reservation, must surrender unconditionally, must accept the authority of the United States government, must give up any claim to their traditional lands along the Lost River, must submit to reservation life and to the control of the Indian agents. In exchange, the government promised that the Modoc would be treated fairly on the reservation, that their complaints about the Klamath would be addressed, that they would be given adequate supplies and support, that those who had killed soldiers during the conflict would not be punished if the band surrendered peacefully, that there would be amnesty for all acts committed during the war if the Modoc would simply agree to return to the reservation and to live peacefully under government authority. Captain Jack's position was equally clear, but completely incompatible with the government's demands. The Modoc wanted to be allowed to return to their traditional lands along the Lost River, wanted to live there peacefully, wanted to be left alone to live as Modoc, wanted a small reservation of their own separate from the Klamath, wanted recognition of their right to exist as a distinct people in the land of their ancestors, wanted the government to honor the promises that had been made in the 1864 treaty, wanted to be treated with dignity and respect, rather than as criminals or as obstacles to be removed. If these terms could not be met, then Captain Jack had a fallback position. He wanted the Modoc to be given a reservation in the lava beds, to be allowed to stay in the stronghold, to be recognized as having the right to defend this territory that they had successfully held against the army for months, to be given supplies and support to survive in this harsh environment, to be allowed to maintain their independence and their identity even if they could not return to their traditional lands. The two positions were fundamentally incompatible, were based on completely different understandings of the situation, were driven by different values and different priorities, and different visions of what justice and fairness meant. The government saw the Modoc as rebels who had defied lawful authority, who had killed soldiers, who had to be punished or at least compelled to submit to government control, who could not be allowed to dictate terms or to maintain their independence, because to do so would encourage other Indian groups to resist, would undermine the government's authority, would make it impossible to implement the reservation system that was the cornerstone of federal Indian policy. The Modoc saw themselves as a people fighting for survival, fighting for the right to exist in their own land, fighting against a government that had broken its promises, that had forced them onto an inadequate reservation where they were starving and dying, that was now trying to force them back to that same inadequate reservation that was treating them as less than human, as obstacles to be removed, rather than as people with rights and dignity and legitimate grievances. The negotiations dragged on for weeks, with meeting after meeting producing no progress, with both sides restating their positions, with both sides becoming increasingly frustrated, with the temporary ceasefire becoming increasingly fragile, with incidents and provocations threatening to reignite the fighting. And as the negotiations continued, as it became clear that the government was not going to offer terms that Captain Jack could accept, a faction within the Modoc band began to argue for a different approach, began to argue that the peace negotiations were a trap, that the government was simply buying time to bring in more troops and to prepare for a final assault, that the peace commissioners could not be trusted, that the only way to demonstrate our seriousness and our determination was to kill the peace commissioners, to show the whites that we would not be intimidated or deceived, to strike a blow that would force the government to take us seriously, to demonstrate that we were willing to die rather than to surrender. This faction was led by a warrior named Hooker Jim, a man who was more militant than Captain Jack, who had less faith in negotiation, who believed that violence was the only language the whites understood, who had been involved in killing white settlers before the war, and who knew that he would probably be hanged if the Modoc surrendered, who had nothing to lose and everything to gain from continuing the fight, who argued passionately that we should kill the peace commissioners at the next meeting, should demonstrate our power and our willingness to fight to the death, should make the whites understand that we would not surrender, that we would not go back to the Klamath reservation, that we would rather die as free Modoc than live as prisoners. Hooker Jim was a charismatic and persuasive speaker, was able to rally support among the younger warriors, was able to play on their frustrations and their anger and their sense that the peace negotiations were going nowhere, that Captain Jack was being too patient and too willing to compromise, that we needed to take dramatic action to change the situation. He argued that killing the peace commissioners would demonstrate our courage and our determination, would show the whites that we were serious, would force them to offer better terms or to leave us alone, would make us heroes among all the Indian peoples who were suffering under white oppression. Captain Jack was reluctant, understood that killing the peace commissioners would make a peaceful settlement impossible, would guarantee that the army would attack with overwhelming force, would probably result in the deaths of many or all of the Modoc, would be a desperate act that would likely end in disaster. He preferred to continue negotiating, to keep trying to find a peaceful solution, to hold out hope that somehow, some way, terms could be found that would allow the Modoc to survive with some degree of dignity and autonomy. But he was also under tremendous pressure from Hooker Jim and the other militants, was being accused of being weak and cowardly, was being told that he was betraying his people by continuing to negotiate with the whites, was being challenged for leadership of the band, was facing the possibility that if he did not agree to the plan to kill the peace commissioners, he would be replaced as chief by someone who would, and that the attack would happen anyway, but without his leadership and his guidance. The pressure intensified over several weeks, with heated debates in the council meetings, with warriors taking sides, with the band dividing into factions, with the unity that had sustained us through the siege beginning to fracture under the stress and the uncertainty and the conflicting visions of what we should do. Captain Jack tried to maintain his authority, tried to argue for patience and for continued negotiation, tried to explain that killing the peace commissioners would be a disaster that would doom us all. But then, in early April, we learned something that changed everything, that confirmed our worst suspicions about the peace negotiations, that made it clear that the whites were indeed planning to betray us, that made even Captain Jack question whether negotiation was possible or whether violence was our only option. One of our scouts, a man who had been watching the army camps, reported that he had seen the peace commissioners preparing for their next meeting with us, and that they were armed, that they were carrying concealed pistols beneath their coats, that they were planning to arrest Captain Jack and the other Modoc leaders during the meeting, that the entire peace negotiation was a trap designed to capture our leaders without having to assault the stronghold and suffer more casualties. This information was brought to a council of the Modoc leaders, and we debated what to do, debated whether the information was reliable, debated whether we should continue with the negotiations or whether we should strike first, debated what the consequences would be either way. Hooker Jim argued passionately that we should kill the peace commissioners, that this was our opportunity to strike a blow against the whites, to demonstrate our power, to show that we could not be deceived or manipulated, to prove that we were warriors who would rather die fighting than be arrested and hanged like criminals. Others argued for caution, for giving the peace process more time, for trying to verify the information before taking such a drastic step, for considering the consequences of killing the peace commissioners, for understanding that such an act would make a peaceful settlement impossible and would guarantee that the army would attack with overwhelming force and would probably destroy us all. Captain Jack was torn, was caught between his desire for peace and his understanding that the whites might indeed be planning to betray us, was facing a decision that would determine the fate of our people, that would either lead to a peaceful settlement or to a final desperate battle that we would almost certainly lose. He asked for time to think, to pray, to seek guidance from the spirits, to make the right decision, to find a way forward that would preserve our people and our dignity. But Hooker Jim would not give him time, challenged him directly in front of the assembled warriors, accused him of being a coward, said that if Captain Jack would not lead the attack on the peace commissioners, then someone else should be chosen as leader. That the Modoc needed a chief who was willing to fight, not one who was willing to surrender, that Captain Jack had lost his courage and his vision and his right to lead. This was the ultimate challenge, the ultimate insult, the ultimate threat to Captain Jack's authority and his position as chief. In Modoc culture, as in most Indian cultures, leadership was based on demonstrated ability and on the respect of the people, not on hereditary right or on formal position. A chief who lost the confidence of his warriors, who was seen as weak or cowardly or unable to lead effectively, could be replaced, could lose his position, could be reduced to the status of an ordinary warrior with no special authority or influence. Faced with this challenge to his leadership, faced with the possibility of being replaced, faced with the knowledge that the peace negotiations were probably a trap, faced with the understanding that the whites were armed and planning to arrest him, faced with the pressure from Hooker Jim and the other militants, faced with the need to demonstrate his courage and his commitment to his people, Captain Jack made his decision, made the choice that would seal his fate and the fate of the Modoc people, made the choice that would make him famous and infamous, that would result in his execution and the scattering of our people, that would end our resistance but would also demonstrate our courage and our refusal to be treated as less than human beings with rights and dignity. He said, his voice quiet but firm, his face showing the weight of the decision he was making. We will go to the next meeting with the peace commissioners, but we will go armed. We will carry our pistols concealed beneath our coats, just as they are carrying theirs. And if they try to arrest us, if they reveal that they are armed, if they give us any reason to believe that they are planning to betray us, if they show any sign that this is a trap, then we will strike first. We will kill them. We will show the whites that the Modoc cannot be deceived, that we will not surrender, that we will not be arrested and hanged like criminals, that we will fight to the death if necessary, that we will die as free Modoc rather than as prisoners of the whites. The decision was made. The die was cast. The course was set that would lead to the death of General Canby and to the end of the Modoc War and to the execution of Captain Jack and to the scattering of our people to reservations far from our homeland. We all understood what this meant, understood that we were crossing a line that could not be uncrossed, understood that killing the peace commissioners would make a peaceful settlement impossible, would guarantee that the army would attack with overwhelming force, would probably result in our deaths or our capture and execution. But we also understood that we had no choice, that the whites had left us no choice, that they were planning to betray us, that they were armed and planning to arrest us during a peace negotiation, that they had violated the sanctity of the peace talks, that they had shown once again that their promises meant nothing, that they could not be trusted, that violence was our only option, that striking first was our only chance of maintaining any shred of dignity and self-respect. The next meeting was scheduled for April 11, 1873, at a location that had been used for previous meetings, a place in the lava beds between the stronghold and the army positions, a place that was supposed to be neutral ground where both sides could meet safely under a flag of truce, a place where the rules of civilized warfare were supposed to apply, where violence was supposed to be unthinkable, where negotiation and compromise were supposed to prevail over force and coercion. Captain Jack selected 5 warriors to accompany him to the meeting: myself, Hooker Jim, Shonchin John, Boston Charlie, and Black Jim. We were all experienced warriors, all men who had proven ourselves in battle, all men who were loyal to Captain Jack, all men who understood what we were being asked to do and who were willing to do it despite the consequences. We were all armed, all carrying pistols concealed beneath our coats, all prepared to kill the peace commissioners if Captain Jack gave the signal, all understanding that what we were about to do would change everything, would make us famous or infamous, would probably result in our deaths, but would also demonstrate our courage and our determination and our refusal to be treated as less than human beings. We spent the evening before the meeting in prayer and preparation, performed the ceremonies that would give us spiritual power and protection, sang the death songs that warriors sing when they know they might not return, made our peace with the spirits and with our families, prepared ourselves mentally and emotionally for what we were about to do. We painted our faces with the symbols of war, marked ourselves as men on a mission of vengeance and justice, as warriors who were willing to die for their people and their dignity. We rode to the meeting place on the morning of April 11th, 1873, arrived to find General Canby and the other peace commissioners already there, waiting for us, sitting on the lava rocks, apparently relaxed and confident, apparently believing that this would be just another negotiating session, apparently not expecting any violence, apparently not understanding that they were about to die, that they had been marked for death by their own treachery, by their decision to come armed to a peace negotiation, by their plan to arrest us and to end the Modoc resistance through deception rather than through honest negotiation. General Canby was there, tall and dignified in his uniform, his grey beard neatly trimmed, his manner calm and professional, a man who seemed to genuinely want to find a peaceful solution, who seemed to be a fair and honourable man, but who was also part of a system that was destroying us, that was taking our land and our freedom and our very existence, that was forcing us onto reservations where we would starve and die, that was breaking its promises and its treaties whenever it was convenient. With him were Alfred Meacham, Eleazar Thomas, and several other men, including an interpreter and some aides. They were all dressed in civilian clothes, were all apparently unarmed, were all presenting themselves as men of peace, as negotiators who were there to find a solution, as people who could be trusted, as representatives of a government that honored its commitments and that treated Indians fairly. But we knew better. We knew that they were armed, that they were carrying concealed weapons, that they were planning to arrest us, that this entire meeting was a trap, that their peaceful appearance was a lie, that they were no more trustworthy than any other whites we had dealt with, that they were part of a system that saw us as obstacles to be removed rather than as human beings with rights and dignity. We dismounted, approached the peace commissioners, exchanged greetings that were formal and stiff, sat down on the lava rocks in a circle, began the meeting that we all knew would end in violence, that would result in the death of a general and the end of any hope for a peaceful settlement, that would seal our fate but would also demonstrate our courage and our refusal to be deceived. The conversation began as it had in previous meetings, with both sides restating their positions, with General Canby explaining what the government was willing to offer, with Captain Jack explaining what the Modoc needed in order to accept a peaceful settlement. The words were familiar, had been spoken many times before, were part of a ritual that both sides knew by heart. We're going through the motions of negotiation, even though we all knew that no agreement was possible, that the positions were too far apart, that neither side was willing to compromise enough to bridge the gap. But as the conversation continued, as we sat there talking and listening and watching, I noticed something that confirmed our worst suspicions. That made it clear that we had been right to come armed, that justified what we were about to do. I saw a bulge beneath General Canby's coat, saw the outline of a pistol, saw that he was armed despite the agreement that peace negotiations would be conducted without weapons, saw that the whites were indeed planning something, that they had come to this meeting prepared for violence, that they were planning to arrest us or to kill us if we did not surrender, that their promises of safe conduct were lies, that their peaceful appearance was a deception. I caught Captain Jack's eye, nodded slightly toward General Canby's coat, made a subtle gesture that indicated what I had seen, made sure that he understood, made sure that he knew that our suspicions had been confirmed, that the time for action was approaching, that we would soon have to make our move or risk being arrested and hanged. Captain Jack's face remained impassive, showed no emotion, gave no sign that he had understood my signal, but I saw his hand move slightly toward his own concealed pistol, saw his body tense slightly, saw that he was preparing to act, that he was getting ready to give the signal that would begin the violence, that would change everything, that would make him the only Indian leader ever to kill a United States Army general. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with both sides going through the motions of negotiation, even though we all knew that this meeting was not going to end peacefully, that violence was coming, that in a few moments everything would change, that blood would be spilled on these lava rocks, that men would die, that the Modoc War would enter a new and final phase. And then Captain Jack asked a question, asked General Canby directly whether the government would allow the Modoc to have a small reservation in the lava beds, whether we could be allowed to stay in the stronghold, whether our right to exist as a distinct people in our own land would be recognized, whether there was any possibility of a settlement that did not require us to return to the Klamath Reservation where we had suffered so much, where so many of our people had died, where we had been treated with such contempt and cruelty. General Canby's answer was firm and final, was delivered in a tone that made it clear that there would be no further discussion, that the government's position was not negotiable, that we would either accept the terms being offered or face the consequences. He said, "No. The government's position has not changed and will not change. The Modoc must return to the Klamath Reservation. There will be no separate reservation for the Modoc in the lava beds or anywhere else. The only terms available are unconditional surrender and return to the reservation. If you do not accept these terms, then the Army will resume military operations and will use whatever force is necessary to compel your compliance. This is your final opportunity to surrender peacefully. If you refuse, then you will be responsible for whatever happens next." And in that moment, Captain Jack made his decision, made the choice that would seal his fate and the fate of our people, made the choice that would make him famous and infamous, that would result in his execution and the scattering of the Modoc people. That would end our resistance, but would also demonstrate our courage and our refusal to be treated as less than human, our determination to die as free Modoc rather than to live as prisoners. Captain Jack stood up slowly, his face showing no emotion, his movements deliberate and controlled, reached beneath his coat, pulled out his pistol, pointed it at General Canby's face and said in English, his voice clear and strong and filled with righteous anger, "You lie. You come here armed. You plan to arrest us. You break the peace. You break every promise you make. You treat us like animals. You give us no choice. Now you die." And he fired. The sound of the shot echoed across the lava beds, a sharp crack that shattered the silence, that announced to everyone within hearing distance that the peace negotiations had failed, that violence had returned, that men were dying. The bullet hit General Edward Canby in the face, just below his right eye, entered his skull, tore through his brain, killed him almost instantly. The general fell backward onto the lava rocks, his arms spreading wide, blood pouring from the wound in his face. His body convulsing once and then going still, his eyes staring sightlessly at the sky, the life gone from them. The only United States Army general ever killed in the Indian Wars was dead, killed by a Modoc chief during a peace negotiation, killed in an act of defiance that would shock the nation and that would guarantee that there would be no mercy for the Modoc, that the full weight of the United States military would be brought to bear against us, that our days were numbered, that we would all soon be dead or captured, that our resistance was over, even though we would continue to fight for a few more weeks before the inevitable end. At the same moment that Captain Jack fired at General Canby, the rest of us drew our weapons and fired at the other peace commissioners, carried out the plan that we had agreed upon, struck simultaneously to maximize the shock and the casualties, to demonstrate our determination and our courage, to show that we would not be arrested without a fight, that we would take some of our enemies with us even if we died in the attempt. Hooker Jim shot and killed Eleazar Thomas, the Methodist minister who had come to the meeting believing that he could help broker a peaceful settlement, who had believed in the power of Christian love and forgiveness to overcome hatred and violence, who died for his naivety and his faith in the goodness of human nature, who fell with a bullet in his heart, who died instantly without understanding what had happened or why. I shot at Alfred Meacham, aimed at his head, pulled the trigger, saw him fall backward with blood streaming from a wound in his scalp. I thought I had killed him, thought that my bullet had found its mark, but he survived, was badly wounded but lived to tell the story of what happened that day, to write his account of the Modoc War, to testify at the trial of Captain Jack and the other Modoc leaders, to spend the rest of his life lecturing about his experiences and showing the scars he had received during the attack. Boston Charlie and Black Jim and Shonchin. John fired at the remaining men, killed one more commissioner, wounded several others, created chaos and panic and terror, sent the survivors fleeing across the lava rocks, running for their lives, abandoning the bodies of their dead companions, racing back to the army camps to report what had happened, to spread the news that General Canby had been killed, that the peace negotiations had ended in massacre, that the Modoc had committed an unforgivable crime that would have to be avenged. The entire attack lasted perhaps 30 seconds, was a sudden explosion of violence that left 3 men dead and several others wounded, that transformed a peace negotiation into a massacre, that demonstrated our desperation and our determination and our willingness to die rather than to surrender, that showed the whites that we would not be deceived, that we would not go quietly, that we would fight to the end even though we knew the end was coming. And then we ran, mounted our horses, rode back to the stronghold as fast as our horses could carry us, knowing that we had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, that we had committed an act that the whites would never forgive, that we had sealed our fate, but that we had also demonstrated our courage and our refusal to be treated as less than human, that we had struck a blow that would be remembered, that would become part of the legend of the Modoc War, that would ensure that our story would be told for generations, even if our people were scattered and our culture was destroyed. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming, was exactly what we had expected, was the fury and the determination and the commitment of resources that we had known would follow the killing of a general. The news of General Canby's death spread across the nation within days, was reported in newspapers from coast to coast, created a wave of outrage and demands for vengeance, led to calls for the complete extermination of the Modoc people, led to editorials demanding that Captain Jack and all the Modoc warriors be hunted down and killed or captured and hanged, led to a national consensus that the Modoc had committed an unforgivable crime that had to be punished in the harshest possible way. The army resumed military operations with a vengeance, poured additional troops and resources into the campaign against us, brought in more artillery and more supplies and more experienced officers, attacked the stronghold with overwhelming force, used their superior numbers and their superior firepower to gradually push us out of the lava beds, to force us to abandon the defensive positions that had served us so well for months, to hunt us through the wilderness like animals, to track us down and to kill us or capture us one by one. We fought back as best we could, continued to use our knowledge of the terrain to our advantage, continued to inflict casualties on the soldiers, continued to demonstrate our courage and our skill as warriors, continued to make them pay for every foot of ground they gained. But we were outnumbered and outgunned and running out of supplies and ammunition, and we were exhausted and demoralized and increasingly desperate, and we knew that we could not hold out indefinitely, that eventually we would be defeated, that our resistance would end in death or capture, that the Modoc War was lost even though we continued to fight. In late May of 1873, after weeks of fighting, after being pushed out of the stronghold, after being hunted through the lava beds and the surrounding wilderness by hundreds of soldiers, after suffering from starvation and exhaustion and the knowledge that our cause was lost, after watching our band fragment and scatter as different groups tried different strategies for survival, Captain Jack and the remaining Modoc warriors who were still with him surrendered to the army, gave up the fight, accepted that we had been defeated, that our resistance was over, that we would now face whatever punishment the whites decided to impose on us. We had fought for 6 months, had held off an army that outnumbered us 10 to 1, had killed dozens of soldiers while losing only a handful of our own warriors, had demonstrated that a small group of determined fighters could resist the might of the United States military if they had the terrain and the will and the courage, had created a legend that would be remembered and told for generations, had shown the world what it meant to be Modoc, to fight for your people and your land and your dignity, even when the odds were overwhelming and the outcome was certain defeat. But in the end, we lost, were defeated not by superior courage or superior skill, but by superior numbers and superior resources and the relentless determination of an enemy that would not give up, that would not negotiate, that would not accept anything less than our complete surrender and our complete submission to their authority. Captain Jack and 5 other Modoc leaders, Shonchin John, Boston Charlie, Black Jim, Hooker Jim, and Slowlux, were put on trial for the murder of General Canby and the other peace commissioners. The trial was held at Fort Klamath in July of 1873, was presided over by a military commission, was a formality rather than a genuine legal proceeding, was designed to provide a veneer of legality to what was really an act of vengeance, to give the appearance of justice while ensuring that the outcome was predetermined, that the defendants would be found guilty and would be sentenced to death. The trial lasted only a few days, with the prosecution presenting witnesses who testified about the attack on the peace commissioners, with the defense presenting arguments that the Modoc had acted in self-defense, that they had been betrayed by the peace commissioners who had come armed to the meeting, that they had been justified in striking first to prevent their own arrest and execution. But the military commission was not interested in these arguments, was not willing to consider the Modoc perspective, was determined to find the defendants guilty and to impose the harshest possible sentence. Captain Jack and 3 others, Shonchin John, Boston Charlie, and Black Jim, were sentenced to death by hanging. Hooker Jim and Slowlux were spared, were given lighter sentences in exchange for their testimony against Captain Jack and the others, were allowed to live in exchange for their betrayal of their chief and their fellow warriors, were despised by the remaining Modoc for their cowardice and their willingness to save themselves at the expense of others. The executions were carried out on October 3, 1873, at Fort Klamath, in front of a crowd of soldiers and civilians who had come to watch the hanging of the Modoc chief, who had dared to kill a United States Army general, who had dared to resist the authority of the United States government, who had dared to fight for his people and his land and his dignity. Captain Jack and the 3 others were led to the gallows, were given an opportunity to make final statements, were allowed to say goodbye to their families, were then hanged in front of the assembled crowd, their bodies left hanging for hours as a warning to other Indians who might consider resistance, as a demonstration of what happened to those who defied the authority of the United States. I was not hanged, was spared because I had not been identified as one of the primary shooters, because there was not enough evidence to convict me of killing any specific person, because I was lucky, or because the whites did not care enough about me to bother with a trial, because they had already executed the leaders and were satisfied with that vengeance. But I was sent to Indian Territory, to Oklahoma, along with the rest of the surviving Modoc. Approximately 150 people out of the original band of more than 200 was forced to leave our homeland, was exiled to a place thousands of miles away, was made to live among strangers in a land that was not ours, was punished for the crime of wanting to live as Modoc in the land of the Modoc. I am an old man now, and I have lived long enough to see the Modoc people scattered and diminished, to see our homeland taken by the whites and turned into farms and ranches and towns, to see our culture and our language fading away as the young people forget who they are and where they came from, to see the places where we lived and fought and died turned into tourist attractions and historical sites where whites come to learn about the Modoc War and to marvel at the courage of the soldiers who defeated us. But I have also lived long enough to see Captain Jack remembered, to see his courage and his determination recognized even by those who condemned his actions, to see his resistance celebrated as an example of what it means to fight for your people and your land and your dignity, even when the odds are overwhelming and the outcome is certain defeat, to see him honored as a leader who refused to surrender, who refused to accept the fate that the whites had planned for us, who chose to die as a warrior rather than to live as a prisoner. I think often about that day when Captain Jack shot General Canby, about the moment when everything changed, when we crossed the line from resistance to open warfare against the peace commissioners themselves, when we demonstrated our refusal to be deceived and our willingness to die rather than to surrender. Was it the right decision? Was it worth it? Did it accomplish anything except to hasten our defeat and to ensure that we would be punished more severely than we might otherwise have been? I do not have simple answers to these questions. I know that Captain Jack did what he believed he had to do, that he was faced with an impossible choice between surrendering and being arrested and hanged, or striking first and demonstrating that the Modoc would not be deceived, that we would not go quietly, that we would fight to the end. I know that he was caught between his desire for peace and his understanding that the whites were planning to betray us, that the peace commissioners were armed and planning to arrest us, that the entire negotiation was a trap designed to end our resistance without having to assault the stronghold and suffer more casualties. I know that from the white perspective, what we did was murder, was a violation of the rules of civilized warfare, was an unforgivable crime that justified the harshest possible punishment. And perhaps they are right from their perspective, from their understanding of how the world works and what rules should govern human behavior. But from our perspective, from the Modoc perspective, what we did was self-defense, was a justified response to betrayal, was a demonstration of our refusal to be treated as less than human, was an assertion of our right to exist and to resist and to fight for our survival, even when the odds were overwhelming and the outcome was certain defeat. General Canby was, by all accounts, a good man, a fair man, a man who genuinely wanted to find a peaceful solution to the Modoc War. But he was also part of a system that was destroying us, that was taking our land and our freedom and our very existence, that was forcing us onto reservations where we would starve and die, that was breaking its promises and its treaties whenever it was convenient, that was treating us as obstacles to be removed, rather than as people with rights and dignity and legitimate grievances. And so Captain Jack killed him, killed the symbol of that system, killed the man who represented the United States government's determination to force us to submit, killed the general who was offering us terms that we could not accept, killed him in an act of defiance that said we would rather die as free Modoc than live as prisoners on a reservation. That said we would not be deceived. That said we would fight to the end, even though we knew the end was coming. I am Scarface Charlie, Modoc warrior, and this is my story, the story of Captain Jack's stand, the story of how 53 Modoc warriors held off 500 United States soldiers for 6 months in the lava beds of Northern California. The story of the day we killed General Edward Canby during a peace negotiation. The story of the betrayal and the violence and the courage and the tragedy of the Modoc War. The story of a people who fought to the end for their right to exist in their own land, who demonstrated their courage and their determination even in the face of certain defeat, who showed the world what it means to be Modoc, to refuse to surrender, to refuse to accept the fate that others have planned for you, to die as a warrior rather than to live as a prisoner. This was the story of Scarface Charlie, of the Modoc people, of Captain Jack and the stronghold, and the killing of General Canby and the end of our resistance, and the scattering of our people. These are the histories that are not written in the school books. If you were moved by this testament and believe these voices must be heard, please take a moment to honor their legacy. Like this video to help it reach others. Subscribe to Tribal Law to ensure you don't miss another chapter of our shared past. And most importantly, leave a comment below. Tell us what part of this story resonated with you, or suggest a piece of history you believe we should uncover next. Your engagement is the fire that keeps these stories alive. Thank you for listening.